Okay, I've got Olly Buxton with me here today. He may be better known to many of you as the Jolly Contrarian. He is an excellent writer and commentator on many topics, including the Lucy Letby case. This is the second time we've had him on the channel, so I'm really grateful for him joining us. So, first of all, hello to Olly.
Hello, Chris. Thank you very much for having me back on your show.
Absolutely no problem. So, as we're recording this, it is not long since the Crown Prosecution Service dropped the charges that have been hanging over Lucy. So, the first question that I'd like to ask you is just to give your reaction to this news and if you have any reflection on that.
Yeah. Well, look, it feels significant, doesn't it? Because the Cheshire Police have gone with what they believe to be a thorough um, assemblage of facts and inferences. I suspect they would say it's as compelling as the facts and inferences that they put before the Crown Prosecution Service many years ago, and it's been rejected. So the first question that everyone, I'm sure, has is, well, is this significant of a some kind of a shift in the thinking in senior parts of the Crown Prosecution Service? I mean, I think it's significant that they didn't cite, they could have fudged the reason for not going ahead, cite a lack of public interest. After all, Ms. Letby's on, however many, it's 15 whole of life terms. She's in prison for the rest of her life. What real good is there in wasting public money, further prosecuting somebody who's already out of harm's way? But they didn't do that. They called out the fact that the charges don't pass the evidential test. Um, and I think it's also somewhat significant that the press release came from a senior person in the London the management of the Crown Prosecution Service, rather than something that's regional in the Northwest. And lastly, I think what's also significant is the Cheshire Police's response. It seems pretty unprecedented to me. I can't remember the last time one prosecuting organ of state has set out a press release like that, expressing disappointment in the decision of another one. You just would love to be a fly on the wall, wouldn't you? And wonder what had been going on behind the scenes. I suspect there has been quite some dialogue between the two, a bit of cajoling and jockeying, and come on, you can't be serious, sort of thing, and that hasn't borne fruit. But I think the convention is that prosecuting organs of state conduct their disagreements in private, and so that this is not really from the usual playbook. So I think that those are my overarching thoughts. But some of the prosecution supporters have made points which are fair. This does not alter the fact that Lucy Letby has been convicted 15 times, and it's easy and tempting to read too much into this. But the other question is, what does this mean for the CCRC referral? Is this something that's possibly been gumming things up? They've been saying, well, let's just see where these further charges go before we make a decision. Is that what's been holding it up? Will that change things? Will things start to move a little bit more quickly suddenly? I mean, it feels to me, Chris, that this is a little bit significant, but I'm aware that we all like to frame things the way we would like the world to be, so perhaps it isn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think fair comment. There's something else that I'd like to ask you is that people have said to me, and I think this is a fair comment, that it would have been in a way more advantageous to Lucy if they had proceeded, because then there would have so much would have been aired
Yeah.
in a public forum. I suppose the downside is she could have lost, theoretically. I don't think that would have
Mm.
happened for 1 second, but it's possible. So what do you think about that?
Well, so there's an interesting precedent for this, in the retrial of the one verdict on which the jury didn't come to a conclusion. And the innocence campaigners would say that that was always going to be a further conviction because the court was able, the prosecution was able to put into evidence as more or less an established fact, this person has been convicted of 15 offences or however many offences it was already. So your question is, given that, do you think she convicted this one? And so therefore the question, the whole question of guilt in a circumstantial case is, firstly, has there been a murder? Secondly, if and only if there is, do we think this person has done it? And since the really difficult question here, and this is the thing I think people really need to grapple with, is the real difficult question is that first question: was there a murder? Since that's been answered, the second question is, well, who did it? It's, well, okay, it's got to have been somebody at the Countess of Chester Hospital. We've got 50 odd staff members that are possibly in the frame. One of them has got a conviction of for serial murder of babies, so it's almost certainly going to be her. So, I mean, that sort of argument could be run again.
Mm.
I think this time, with the information that we've got, so I would expect the defence to resist it a lot more aggressively, and certainly if they failed to have that sort of similar fact evidence sort of thing thrown out, you'd expect the defence to much more aggressively try to rebut that proposition. And of course, literally litigating all of that sort of stuff in open court, challenging those convictions, all gets reported in the media. It's under the sub judice rules. None of that looks good if the defense arguments are much more sophisticated than the prosecution ones. And I dare say that's something that, if I was the Crown prosecutor, I certainly wouldn't want to lie myself in front of that particular steamroller. But this is all speculation, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's a reasonable conclusion, though. I'm sure that I mean, I personally believe that would have played a part in the decision. I'm sure it did. Because obviously Mark McDonald's made it very publicly known that he has 31 experts. He keeps going up by a couple every few weeks. They will know very well, the Crown Prosecution Service. Well, we've got one, or maybe they might have, I've heard that the police have one expert who may have worked on this submission. We don't know if they did or not, but we know they won't have 31, and we know they won't have the same caliber. So I'm sure that played into the thinking. I'm sure it will have done.
Yeah, I mean, it's a part of the theme of the debate here is you have effectively got the prosecution side is just doubling down and doubling down and doubling down on a decision that has already been made, whereas the defense argument is just look at everything else in the universe and everything else that it tells us and what that tells us about the prior status of that single decision that has been made. And it's I find that a very interesting and compelling part of the whole the whole debate, is that there just doesn't seem to be anything coming out beyond the things that were actually led in court that has any sort of inferential or probative value that supports that decision made in court.
Yeah, I mean, the way you describe it is kind of a clash between precedent versus data, isn't it? And I think people like you and I would always follow data. Like, I don't really care about precedent. I know there was a court case, but I just care about the information and what that points to. I think I always find it very strange when people cite process. Oh, but there's been a process. Yeah, but the process can be wrong. So it doesn't really mean anything. I want to ask you as well about the Netflix trailer, because as we record this, that's been released in the last 24 hours. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts and reflections on that as well.
So not enormous. I don't know a lot about it. I didn't know it was coming. It was very interesting to see that they have some unreleased footage. And that unreleased footage seems to give the lie to a particular line of prosecution cross-examination of Ms. Letby about what she was wearing at the time she was she was arrested, which in itself is interesting. I mean, there's a somewhat of a suspicion that the Cheshire Police is been involved and is sort of embedded in this documentary and might influence it. I don't know. I doubt it. I'm quite a big fan of Netflix documentaries. As it happens, I've watched a lot of them, and they tend to be pretty thorough sort of things, and they tend to throw quite a lot of resources at it and look at things from all sides. And you imagine that this has been in production for a little while. It takes a while to create video content. And you can only imagine that whilst it's been in production, the people that are engaged in making a film about Lucy Letby and her convictions will naturally have been interested in the goings on afterwards, and they seem to have picked some of that up. I can see that Mr. MacDonald has been interviewed about the whole thing, so it will be interesting to see where they get to on the whole process. I'm not sure. Well, for this to have a positive outcome for the prosecution side, there will need to be some evidence that is there that they have, which no one has seen before. Now, the Cheshire Police may have provided that to them, I guess, but if they had, it's really odd that the Cheshire Police hasn't used it itself in the meantime. It's been fairly sophisticated in its use of public relations and media and that sort of stuff. So I'm not sure this is going to move the dial a great deal, but what it might do is bring people, casual people that haven't really paid a lot of attention to the case a little bit closer to it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Would guess the proof will be in the pudding. We'll see what happens in the full documentary. Of course, clearly the most interesting thing to come out of the trailer is Lucy being arrested in her bedroom. Uh, I mean, that obviously clashes quite jarringly with what was said in court, as I've already discussed in a previous video. So we'll just have to see what happens in the full documentary. I mean, I find it, just to respond briefly to one thing that you said, I think we can say almost definitively already they're not going to come up with anything new. So it will just be even the trailer kind of makes that clear by saying they put the shift chart up. So I mean that doesn't bode well for the prosecution in this documentary, but we'll see what they have to say. So we're going to go on to discuss some other issues related to Lucy's case. And I know you're interested in systems, the behavior of systems, the way systems perform, and the way that they can go wrong. But also, I know you have a view that a system can be doing what it's meant to do, and yet still the outcome can be disastrous. So that's a very interesting concept. Can you unpack that for us?
Sure. So, and it is a really interesting concept and doesn't on its face have a great deal to do with the Letby case. But so organizational sociologists and psychologists for a long time have looked at famous disasters in organizational, in large organizations and asked themselves, how could this happen and how could these sort of things continue to happen? And there's a particular book I might have mentioned it the last time we spoke by a chap called Charles Perrow called Normal Accidents. How big risks can come about in organizations, and he essentially identified that an organization, large organizations are complex systems. They are um, interacting networks of individuals with autonomy who are exercising judgment, exercising expertise, exercising discretion, and interacting with each other. And in any complex system, an ecosystem is a complex system. It's very, very difficult to linearly calculate how they're going to behave in all circumstances. In fact, it's impossible. So, when we talk about probabilities and rolling dice and things like that, these are necessarily designed around simple systems that are not complex. So if I roll a dice, it can only come up with one of six sides, and one of those six sides all have an equal opportunity to come up because I've designed the die especially, so uh, that should happen. And there's no chance that if you roll a dice and it's a six, the six will just at the last minute get up and turn itself over and make itself into a one. There's no intelligence in the in the process of rolling a dice. So when we make statistical inferences about dice rolls, we can be very, very confident about what the likelihood is, particularly over a large sequence of events. Now, when you're dealing with a complex system, and complex systems not only have intelligent people exercising judgment and changing things in reaction to other things that are happening in the system, which makes them unpredictable, but also these systems tend to be inchoate. They're not complete. They're not bounded. They don't have a fixed and defined edge. People drift in and drift out of these things, which makes them even more difficult to predict their action. So these systems, organizations, space agencies, air traffic control systems, and that sort of thing, we nonetheless get them to work mostly in a sensible and predictable way. And we can see, for example, the air traffic control system gets safer and safer and safer every year. We get better at it because each time unexpected things happen, we iron them out and stop them and don't let them happen again. But in any case, the Perrow's point and the sociologist's point would be to say that, look, sometimes this system will operate and it will interact with itself and with other systems in an unexpected way. And when it does that in unexpected ways, little things that you might not expect to make much of a difference, little trivial errors, bits of grit, things that aren't quite functioning properly, that look insignificant, can combine in what they call a non-linear fashion. So it's not 2 + 2 = 4, it's 2 × 2 × 2. So things can quickly spiral out of control. And particularly if the system is what Perrow called tightly coupled, so that it can create chain reactions and things can happen very quickly. You can have something which is not on its face, even an error can create an absolute disaster. It can create a catastrophic failure mode. So what examples of this? The Space Shuttle Challenger. It was brought down by a rubber O-ring that wasn't functioning. 3 Mile Island, there was a nuclear meltdown in the mid 1970s. That was caused by a malfunctioning safety valve shutting off and not alerting itself in the system. It was a safety feature. You know, the Piper Alpha platform disaster in the back end of last century, again, terrible explosion caused by the crew switching off seawater intake safety valves in order to say to mean deep sea divers were safer and weren't getting sucked into these valves. Mount Erebus airline disaster, Air New Zealand airline disaster. Somebody transposed a couple of digits in some flight plan coordinates, and so the plane didn't fly around a mountain; it flew straight into it. And on the day, it just happened to be a cloudy day with aerial whiteout, and so the pilot couldn't see what was happening. So these sorts of accidents are inevitable, and they can't be predicted, and they can't be stopped. You only find out about them when they happen. Okay, so this is a long exegesis of something that's not quite relevant to what we're talking about, Chris, but that's the catastrophic failure. Now, it's also possible that you can have a system that is failing, but in non-catastrophic ways, so that it looks like it's behaving correctly, but in fact, it's got some kind of a latent defect in it. And this is the thing that's a little bit closer to the sorts of the sorts of things that we've seen in some of these systemic failures that we've been talking about recently. You know, you can't miss an exploding space shuttle. You know something's gone wrong there, but you can miss a few cases of asbestos poisoning. And in fact, it took over 100 years before anyone cottoned on to the fact that asbestos wasn't, in fact, a safe fire retardant, but was, in fact, carcinogenic. You know, you can you can, you can sometimes miss the fact that 900 postmasters, sub postmasters, have been convicted when in fact they haven't committed any fraud. These things can happen, and if they happen when the system gets itself into an unusual position and just repeats in that unusual position. And it's only when you realize that, oh hell, we've got a problem here. That's exactly what happened with the sub postmasters. Suddenly, preference cascade, the entire world wakes up and goes, oh Lord, what have we done here? And it's an absolute disaster, and the thing can be fixed. So, with all that background, the question comes up: healthcare serial murders, and we're not talking necessarily about Lucy Letby here, but just the phenomenon of healthcare serial murders.
Mm.
Could you consider that to be a system glitch? Could this be a system in normal failure mode, but just in a way that we can't see it? So it's telling us we've got these serial murderers in the healthcare system, but in fact something is glitching and is going the wrong way. Now, I don't know, but the alternative is that the system's got this thing correct, and um, we have got psychopathic murderers in the healthcare system, and psychopathic murderers in the healthcare system feels to me to be a highly, highly unlikely thing. All of the way, all of the incentives that we've set up, the vetting processes in the health service, the credentialization, the intelligence levels of the people that sort of work in the health service, and also just the way that intensive care units and health services tend to be incredibly highly monitored places. All of this seems to mitigate against the idea that somebody could be opportunistically picking off patients and murdering them, or would have anything to do. So you ask your question, okay, well, could this be a system glitch? And if it's a system glitch, only look at asbestos, look at the sub postmasters, say, well, okay, if it's a system glitch, this should happen every time this circumstance comes up. You'd expect the same thing to happen. So therefore, your test of that argument, could this be a systems problem, is how often does this happen? Is this a one-off? Is Lucy Letby the only person that's ever been charged with healthcare serial murder in these particular circumstances, or not? And the answer is very clear. These things happen all the time. They happen roughly once a year, and have done for the last 50 years throughout the Western world. And there have been a number of celebrated cases, and I'm sure you know about them, Lucia de Burke, Daniela Poggiali, where people have been convicted on just identical bases to Lucy Letby, and it's transpired later to have been a false conviction. And so therefore, the question comes up, okay, we've got two possible explanations to what is going on here. One is a fairly well established and recognizable case of a system in error mode, and the other is we have got a person, and Lucy is literally could not be a better exemplar of this, because she's unusually has an unusually clean record, if you like, but a person with no history of any sort of psychiatric or psychological discomfort, well educated, comes from a comfortable family, is popular, seen as a very diligent nurse, no suggestion of disciplinary records, let alone criminal records or anything like that, and has been working in the health service for however many years, and suddenly starts without reason murdering people. It's just seems the most implausible thing in the world. And so, and we'll talk a little bit more, I dare say, about statistics and probabilities. But you have a base rate question here. It's like the base rate question. One of these things is this just one of these things where the system has got itself in a pickle and has identified the wrong person? What's the probability of that? Actually pretty high. Or is this that weird one-off person who, without any background reason for it, no pathology, nothing to explain it, has just inexplicably started doing the most demonic and unspeakable things. And that's a question that I think we could probably spend a little bit more time looking at as a society than apparently we do. This has happened. So, I should say that this same scenario has happened again a couple of times in the last couple of weeks. I don't know if you've seen the news. There's been a French anaesthetist by the name of
Mm,
Frederic Pechier, I think,
mm.
who has been convicted of multiple murders over a long period of time. Exactly the same pattern. Look, I don't know the facts of the matter, but what I do know, it just seems to stack up exactly. And I
Mm.
think there's been a young woman in Virginia by the name of Erin Strotman who has been arrested again for attacking infants again without any direct evidence. And it's just happening over and over again. And it's like, now, actual serial murders are falling off a cliff. The statistics are saying that they've just gone from quite high in 1989 to almost none now. But for some reason, perfectly well socialized medical professionals seem to continue wanting to murder innocent people. It just doesn't make it, demands an explanation, and no one's made any attempt to give one.
Yeah. So I suppose a couple of things to say to that. Firstly, just to respond to your final point, it needs an extraordinary and very concrete level of evidence for me. Just saying, oh, we didn't like the look of these figures and they were around a lot of the time. It's not really good.
Mm,
It is the main thing. That's the first thing. And then secondly, I should just say as a disclaimer that I haven't discussed other nurse cases or other healthcare professional cases on this channel, other than I briefly discussed on a couple of occasions. Well, I think I did a fair bit on Colin Campbell once, Colin Norris, who was previously known. And the reason for that is I have met the experts that were involved in that case, and they have explained to me in some depth why he's innocent. I don't feel qualified to comment certainly about the new cases, but also there's numerous other nurses, as you rightly pointed out in this country, whose cases probably deserve further examination. I literally know nothing about them, so I don't talk about them. I have to obviously concentrate on Lucy's case, but I hope, naturally, I believe Lucy should be exonerated. I hope that happens soon, and I hope that that could be the key that unlocks the door to reassessing some of these other cases. And at that time, I would certainly familiarize myself with more of the details of those cases. I feel like I've only got one pair of hands, and
mm,
I just can't feasibly do that. And I don't want
mm,
to comment about something that I don't know about, really. So I just wanted to make that clear, but I'm not in any way not. I mean, I do have feelings about them, but I don't talk about them because just lack of knowledge, really. Um, so with that being said, and with all these comments about systemic problems that are very fascinating to listen to, and you cite many problems, I actually thought of another one where things very, very nearly went wrong, but thankfully didn't. And that's a couple of times, there's probably more, but there's at least a couple of times where there was very nearly a full-scale nuclear war. One of the most notable examples of this is the Cuban Missile Crisis, where there was a guy in a Soviet submarine called Arkhipov who stopped Russian retaliation because
yeah.
they thought they were being attacked at the time. And if
Yeah,
he
he
had,
just he just refused to follow his orders, didn't he, or something?
yeah,
It was
yeah, and
extraordinary.
basically, if he had followed his orders, we'd all be dead. Well, I wouldn't even been here because I wasn't even alive. So,
Yeah.
we just very
We should be
likely.
more grateful to that chap.
Well, absolutely. Some days I wonder if we'd have been better off just letting it happen. But generally speaking, I feel a full-scale nuclear war is not a good thing. So, yeah, so that's one example. And there's also another one where it's a similar scenario to what's depicted in the film War Games from the 1980s, where they accidentally put a simulation of a nuclear war, but
Mm,
actually put it on the screen, and they only just realized in time. And they'd begun the process of preparing to respond. And thankfully they noticed in time. It's depicted in another
mm,
series as well. So yeah, so those are two examples of systems. There's another couple of examples of systems nearly going very, very wrong. So with that being said, I know that you kind of touched upon this in your answer, that there's a kind of cultural tendency to seek villains rather than accept these systemic failings. So I don't know if you'd like to speak about that a bit firstly, and also another question that naturally follows from that is, can we do anything to address this?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think there is, look, there is a cultural tendency to seek villains, but I'm going to go a little bit off the script here for the Letbyists, Chris, and say this cuts both ways. And so one of the things I've been at pains to say is, look, that the evidence that you see in front of you, this collected evidence which has been carefully marshaled and collated to build this picture of this killer nurse, this angel of death, whatever you call her, is it seems to me pretty preposterous. But exactly the same things happening the other way around. And so we have a number of people on the let be as innocent side who are making, to my mind, completely unwarranted and unnecessary allegations about participants in the prosecution and the trial and advocates on the other side. And I think it, there's a real cognitive dissonance there that really that I really struggle with. I think it's not needed, and I think it's counterproductive because it makes you look a little hypocritical as much as anything else. But there's just a much more simpler explanation than these consultants at the hospital were conspiring to put an innocent person in jail for the rest of her natural life. That the expert witnesses did that, that police did that, and that is just cognitive bias. This stuff happens all the time. People are, systems are set up to incentivize people to behave in ways that are just absolutely mad. And just in the same way that, thinking Lucy Letby was murdering children on such scant evidence is mad. It's similarly mad to not see it the other way. And it strikes me the best thing to do is and again, I sort of come back to this statistical methodology. First thing to do is work out what has happened here. How has this collection of people, institutions, organizations conspired and contrived to create this result? Because don't forget, the criminal justice system is set up to identify people who are lying and identify people who are conspiring and to cut them out. It's got fail-safes in it that are designed to prevent that sort of stuff. And the fact that they didn't trigger, I think, is probably as telling and as important part of this story as anything else. If these guys were conspiring, it probably would have been found out. But if you're not conspiring, it's a it's a kind of different thing. It's much easier to see this as, look, you've built yourself a narrative. Oh, looks like we've got a live one here. You've got in, you've committed, you've dug yourself into a hole. And now you've dug yourself into a hole. All of the system incentives force you to double down on that. It's because the cognitive dissonance and the embarrassment of admitting that you might have got it wrong just become too intolerable. And you mentioned some great examples of the Cuban Missile Crisis and whatnot of human beings, all of whom are apparently the most educated and empowered people in the world, just making howlers of decisions and nearly doing it. There's another one which is completely out of left base, but I don't know if you've heard of it. This an idea that's the Saudi royal family had to build a long 300-kilometer long city in the desert. Right. And this thing was going to be 500 meters high and 200 meters wide and 300 kilometers long. That's from London to Norwich. And it's just like, on its face, that is just an absolutely preposterously stupid idea, and it's never going to happen. I don't think you could get the raw materials to do that. But nonetheless, the entire industry swung in behind, and you had consultants and auditors and accountants and construction people, and they started actually, building holes in, in the desert and whatnot. And this makes no sense on any level. Nobody would want to live there. It wouldn't work. The design doesn't make any sense. Why would you build it in a line and not, in a circle if you're going to going to be like that. It was just like some sort of fever dream from a J.G. Ballard novel, but
Mm.
nonetheless, the entire well-paid industry of the city of London, New York, everywhere, just piled in behind it, asking no questions. Sure, someone's paying the bill. Let's LFG sort of thing. So I just don't think we should underestimate motivated irrationality, right? We just shouldn't do that. And that's all that's happened here. And if you can get to a position where everyone accepts, okay, look, motivated irrationality, a bad thing has happened. So firstly, you get the correct outcome, which is, oh, let's not make that mistake again, and let's get these people that have been victims of this motivated irrationality, just get them out and rehabilitate them. And then you might go, okay, look, is there any reason that we've got to think that people were acting more than just stupidly here? Now we can go and look at that. But I think confusing those two things and starting that debate now just makes you look color, biased. It makes you look like you've got an axe to grind.
Mm.
This should not be about axes to grind. This should be about sorting out a system that we're all part of that is not functioning how we would like it to function.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I feel I should comment on this. So in the recent Hummingbird document that at the time of recording, I've yet to analyze on the channel, but it's possible that I will have released the video in which I do analyze it before I release this one, confusingly. But I think people are aware of this 150-page document on Operation
Yeah.
Hummingbird with lots of very useful material. And it is acknowledged, I think, at the beginning of that document that there is a small schism. I don't think it's significant because I think we've all stuck together really well as a campaign, if you want to call it that. But there's a disagreement or a difference of opinion on the issue that you've just mentioned. And I have said on this channel previously that I don't think Lucy was deliberately targeted from day one, and I've explained my reasons for that. Um, and I've also said I can be wrong. I can definitely be wrong. There's people that I really respect who believe this, and I don't dismiss their views at all. Um, I just cannot say that I believe that because I don't have what I believe to be satisfactory evidence. It can be inferred from certain things, but I don't think the evidence is strong enough to support it. It doesn't ultimately make sense to
Mm.
me. However, leaving that issue aside, I also want to make it clear I can't, even if, yes, it can be inferred from certain things, but I definitely can't prove it. So, just from a legal perspective, there is no way that I can say that. And I'm very careful about saying what I can prove. And that, there may be absolutely no legal consequences for me to say that on this channel, but effectively it is libelous if you can't prove it.
Yeah, no, totally, totally.
So,
And,
I just
and
wanted to make that clear.
Yeah, and look, the other thing is it sort of comes back to a point that I was whittering on about before, Chris, is if these people are all acting maliciously and there is some conspiracy to do down Lucy Letby, then this would be a unique scenario. You wouldn't expect to see this anywhere else because in any other healthcare scenario where there's a cluster of deaths, people aren't maliciously trying to do people down. This is just a very unique, not to be repeated thing. And again, that's just not what the data shows. This happens a lot. And if it can happen 50 times, then unless we're saying that, part of the systemic problem we've got is we have malicious people all over the place who are trying to do down innocent nurses and anaesthetologists and doctors and whatnot, then that is just not a necessary explanation. And again, it's, you know, we will, I suspect, talk about Bayesian inference pretty soon, but you've got to go with the most likely, most probable explanation if you don't have any evidence to suggest anything better. And the most probable explanation for me is that this is just people acting mediocrely. That's all it requires. You can explain all of this without missing anything and without any puzzle, just by saying this is people who are all looking after their own backsides and afraid of consequences, who are acting selfishly and unwisely, but not maliciously.
Yeah, and I want to add as well, that's why I made my video about the 20 chances they had for this could have been stopped in 20 different places. So if
Mm.
just one of those 20 things had happened, I wouldn't be here now. I never would have met Ollie. We wouldn't be discussing
Yeah,
this. You wouldn't know the name Lucy Letby.
yeah,
Um, so it just was, I believe it was what we've described a massive systemic failure. But also, I don't expect people to agree with me, and I always respect other people's opinion. And some of my biggest supporters disagree with me on this, so I always give them the absolutely respect their view, and they're perfectly entitled to express that. And I would never say otherwise. But I would like people to consider the fact that that ramps up the risk for those that, if they were deliberately targeting her, it could have all fallen apart any moment. And I know they're
yeah.
powerful. I know they're powerful people, and it's difficult to take on a consultant, but they're facing a grievance procedure in which they've lost every point. Then they push for a police investigation that collapses. Then at that point, there'd probably be a medical investigation. Then the RCPCH could come in and say, "Oh, look, someone stuck a needle in the wrong place. Someone's done this. You didn't give this person antibiotics. You didn't respond to this. We already know you're only doing two ward rounds a week. That gentleman who said that Lucy's dislodged a tube, he's in London recording for the BBC half the time. They really were making a very large rod for their own back,
Yeah, yeah,
potentially.
yeah.
So I just wanted to make that clear as well. With that being said, I know a lot of people will continue to disagree with me, and that's absolutely fine. Um, so let's move on to the next question, which is what specific legal reforms would most quickly improve the ability to correct wrongful convictions that hinge on scientific uncertainty?
Big question. And I should preface this by saying I'm not a criminal law specialist. The pitchforkers delight in reminding me about that every time I engage with them. But I thought about this, Chris, and I came up with four.
They never reflect on their own lack of qualifications, funnily enough.
There you go. Yes, quite. But look, I'm not a big one for appeals to authority. So the last thing I'd like to do is appeal to my own authority or qualification. I figure I'll put out some thoughts, and if they make sense, then I'm grateful. If they don't, please let me know. I'm not claiming to be any great expert here, but sort of, and I also wonder, being slightly on the outer. So yeah, I'm not a criminal lawyer, but I've been peripherally involved in it, and in a role where for many years where you are managing potential criminal liabilities and things like that. So it's something you have to think about. But I think it's sometimes useful to have someone that sort of understands the lingo and understands the background. I've got a legal qualification. I have passed papers in criminal law. I want to be clear about that. I'm not completely ignorant about these things, but it's useful for someone that has a little bit of distance to come in and say, well, does that really make any sense to think about things that way? And so here are my four things in that spirit. First one is the appeal route. So the way that you appeal a criminal thing. So you have a criminal case is at the High Court level. There is a direct right of appeal to the Court of Appeal Criminal Division. Thereafter, there is an appeal to the Supreme Court, but only if the Court of Appeal Criminal Division is prepared to certify that there is an issue of, I think, public importance is the expression, that warrants the Supreme Court looking at it. And curiously, the Supreme Court cannot gainsay that. The legislation governing the requirement, only the Court of Appeal can license an appeal beyond the Court of Appeal. And we saw a very interesting and to to be to be clear, the Court of Appeal really doesn't like doing that and does it very, very rarely. And I'm told again, I don't want to make too much of a thing about this 'cause I might be wrong, but I'm told that it is fairly well known that the Court of Appeal Criminal Division judges believe that the Supreme Court does not have the sufficient expertise in criminal law and practice to consider issues. So it thinks it is the best place in the land. For me, that is absolutely mad. And if that's true, it needs to be addressed and fixed, and there need to be criminal experts appointed to the Supreme Court. But it doesn't seem to me to be true. And so one of my answers, one of my justifications for saying that is that there have been a succession of really quite embarrassing mistakes that have been made at the Court of Appeal level. We've talked already about the Post Office Horizon debacle, really. We know of several other recent miscarriages of justice, and in particular Tom Hayes's LIBOR convictions, which I think you talked to Tom Hayes a couple of
Mm.
weeks or so ago on your podcast, and that one only got overturned because the Court of Appeal accidentally certified an appeal to the Supreme Court on a very narrow point. It's a little tiny little thing. Just answer this question, and the Supreme Court goes, "Ha ha! Right now it's ours,"
Mm.
and reviewed the whole thing and was really quite excoriating about it. So
Mm.
the first thing is, I don't understand why it is the way it is, but it cannot be right that the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, cannot dictate which cases go to it. I dare say that if it were able to, it could say immediately now that this case, the Letby case, should go to the Supreme Court, and that would very quickly resolve this without need for a CCRC. So a separate part of that discussion is the role of the CCRC, the Criminal Cases Review Commission, in overturning cases. And again, a factor that just makes no sense. So the CCRC can take a submission from any defendant at any time. It's never barred. You're never out of chances. You can keep writing to the CCRC and ask them to take your case until you are taken out in a box. But the CCRC's role, it must review it, and then it puts it before the Court of Appeal Criminal Division. So this is often the Court of Appeal Criminal Decision will be the forum that has made the decision that the CCRC is asking to complain against, asking it to review. So we've got two problems there. Firstly, we've got that sort of defensiveness, commitment, to your own existing decision, and reluctance to be told that you got it wrong first time, which is just a natural human instinct. And secondly, and we saw this in the LIBOR case, the Court of Appeal is bound by precedent. It cannot make a decision different to one that is made that is materially the same in the past. Now, the law of precedent is something that will be familiar to and dear to all law students and lawyers that may be listening to the podcast, but it might not be as obvious to non-lawyers. But in any case, if a decision is made by the Court of Appeal on a certain number of material facts, and they're sort of abstract concepts of fact and law, then if that same scenario, materially the same issue, comes up before the Court of Appeal again, it must make the same decision. Now, ordinarily, there's a fag paper between two different cases, and you were wearing blue trousers, he was wearing red trousers, so that's different. I'm being a little facetious, but with Hayes's case, the Court of Appeal literally said, I don't think the first decision was wrong. And secondly, even if I did, I can't make a different decision anyway because I'm bound by precedent. And the precedent was made in this actual case, not even in a case like this one. So there's just, that's just a logical endpoint. That means the CCRC is referring itself to a judicial forum that can't make a different decision. Doesn't make any sense. So that's another thing that I think needs to to be corrected pretty quickly. So I'm rabbiting on, Chris, aren't I? So that I think was point um, number one. So number two, okay, the Court of Appeal, Criminal Division, and the courts famously are most reluctant to hear that they may have got things wrong, and this needs to change, and it needs to change for a very clear, rational, logical reason. This involves no criticism of anybody in the judicial system. The court convicts on a burden of proof of beyond reasonable doubt. That means almost certainty, but not quite certainty. It therefore follows, as a statistical matter over a number of cases, that the Court of Appeals, so that the court's conviction methodology will, not might, but will convict people who are innocent. It is designed to do that. Again, that is a system design. So this is acknowledged. I don't think anybody denies it. Beyond, there's a great deal of jurisprudence about what beyond reasonable doubt means and so on and so forth. But in any case, you must acknowledge it. So let's say beyond reasonable doubt means 99% certain. So you're 1% uncertain. It follows, if you are getting it right, that one person in 100 will be innocent, that you convict properly, again, this is a normal accidents thing. Without making any errors, you have convicted somebody who is innocent. So therefore, the system needs to acknowledge that it is designed to generate the occasional injustice, and therefore it must be designed to quickly undo those cases, right? That's just got to be a top priority. Andy Melkinson, who was recently exonerated, was exonerated 17 years after being falsely convicted. It's just outrageous. Anybody in the criminal justice system at any point who hears that and it is not thoroughly shamed, shouldn't be working. That's just outrageous. Okay, so that's number two. Number three is the expert witness regime. The expert witness regime has been criticized for many years. The Law Commission put out a paper, I think 10, 15 years ago, saying this really needs to be completely changed. The prevailing government at the time ignored it. But at any rate, we've got a position which is just rife for confirmation bias and cognitive bias. Firstly, expert witnesses are appointed and remunerated by the litigating parties, right? So the prosecution and the defense. So if you want to get your money from the prosecution, you have to tell them what they want. And if you say, no, sorry, I don't think this doesn't stand up, they'll be, thanks very much, you can go. I'll find another I'll find another expert. Now, this would be fine if you're just presenting witnesses to put your case, but an expert witness is designed to be there not to assist the prosecution or the defense, but to assist the court. So it just cannot be right that the court is assisted by saying, okay, get one guy who's pro, one guy who's con, and we'll sort of knock out the difference. The whole point of an expert witness is that they are providing information that is not intuitive, that a jury couldn't be expected to infer using its own powers of judgment, and nor could a judge, and actually nor could a barrister. So you've got a bunch of reasons that this is really, really dangerous. And Ben Myers, the Lucy Letby's KC, I should say, during the trial, has been criticized for not understanding certain points in the expert evidence and not cross-examining correctly. It's like, it's the reason that you've got an expert witness there in the first place is because regular Joes can't be expected to understand all this sort of stuff. Even King's Counsel, sorry fellas, true, even King's counsel are regular Joes. They are not, insulin assay, immunoassay experts or whatever. So we need to recognize that. So how would you fix that? Firstly, experts are appointed by the court. The two sides can formulate what they believe the issues to be, and put that to the judge. And this is where the judge makes a decision as a matter of law rather than facts about what the issues are and what the information that needs to be put before the jury about it. And then in camera, so without the jury seeing this, the judge, parties and experts, and they can call different experts if they want, have a discussion, and there are witness briefings to do all this sort of stuff, where they agree on these questions that everyone agrees needs to be answered as a matter of expert law. This information is agreed, hammered out, and the judge makes a decision as a matter of law, because if it's a matter of law, it can then be appealed later. As a matter of that, this statement of the facts will be presented to the jury. Okay. And ideally, both prosecution and the defense will agree to this statement of facts. And so this is just saying, jury, there's some real complicated stuff here. You don't need to know the details. You don't need to listen. You don't need to assess the veracity of the person that's saying this. These are the facts. You should take these as read. This is the God's honest truth. Now, people will say there's some ways of criticizing that. Firstly, what if the prosecution and the defense don't agree and can't agree? So firstly, there's two ways this can happen. Firstly, prosecution and defense are acting meretriciously. They're being stubborn because the defense knows, oh God, I'm banged to rights. He's got this ballistics evidence. It's going to prove that my guy's banged to rights. No way I'm agreeing that. Then the judge sees that and says, I don't care. I'm striking you out. I'm making this ballistic evidence that is here. I'm putting this before the jury as a matter of law. And then that barrister, if he wants to, can appeal that and go have that discussion and explain why that's not a reasonable thing to do. The other reason that the defense and the prosecution might not agree is because, and this is the one that's relevant here, is because the science isn't clear, right? So you've just got one guy saying, well, I think it's this, and the other guy says, well, I think it's that. And in that case, what you've got is a situation where the science is not settled enough for the jury to have anything put before them. So if you've got people that just saying, well, don't really know, then that evidence should not be put before the jury, and it certainly shouldn't be put before the jury by someone saying, hey, trust me, I'm a scientist, I'm not biased, I'm doing this. So and the fact that that doesn't happen for me is crazy. I mean, the last thing is that there was a suggestion that expert evidence be heard concurrently. I think they call it hot tubbing. So you get all the experts sitting in a hot tub together, and they just discuss that, debate it. And again, this is not an adversarial way of finding facts, but for expert evidence, this is technical, scientific stuff, ballistics, medical stuff, and that sort of stuff. This is not meant to be cut and thrust. This isn't meant to be controversial. You just need someone that can give a sensible discussion of that to the court, and I think it can actually be done away from the jury, as I say. So those are the three big ones. The last one, and this is a much harder one, I think, to implement, is just to ask the court system to be much more mindful of inferential reasoning and how to diagnose these things, how to start with the base rate and work from the most probable explanation is this, and before getting on to there's a risk, there's some suggestion that this nurse might have done this dastardly thing, which is just highly improbable. First thing is, okay, before we go anywhere near that, how have we satisfied ourselves that these acts for which there was no direct evidence, we are only relying on circumstantial evidence, and circumstantial evidence is by its nature probabilistic, it increases or decreases likelihood. How are we certain that this probable that this most likely abstract cause is not in fact the case here, right? So you have a um, two-step inquiry process. The first is to say, okay, we've got a puzzling conundrum here, right? Um, 15 infant deaths in a ward where there's normally one or two a year. Okay, what's the thing here? So okay, so what's the most likely explanation for this? Uh, what is the okay? So what's the likelihood that this could have happened as a just a matter of random stochastic probability? Given a given base rate, standard deviation, you can go, right. And in fact, this can be done, and I think Professor David Spiegelhalter did do it and said, well, so your standard deviations, whatnot, over here. So you'd expect to have a spike from one case or three cases, whatever it was, to 15 once in 100 years. Okay, so that sounds like that's not very likely at all. Okay, but that's actually a 1 in 100 chance that you could have this thing. And of course, you've got linear probabilities and widthwise probabilities. So once in 100 years or once in 100 hospitals in a single year, right? Now, there are a lot of hospitals and 100, there are a lot more than 100 hospitals. So what we're really saying is this is the sort of thing you would expect to happen at random once a year in 100 hospitals. And so maybe I don't know how many hospitals there are in the UK. Let's say there's 1,000. You'd expect this sort of statistic to happen once every, 10 times a year. Now, do you think that is the most likely explanation, or that there is a malicious nurse, no criminal record, never done any of this before, that's just been going around systematically murdering these people without being seen, leaving no evidence, leaving no trace behind her at all? So, what are the odds of that? And again, that we can, the probabilities aren't quite as good, Chris, because there's a real risk of false positives because there are a bunch of people that have been convicted for this that didn't actually do it. But okay, let's run with it. Let's just say, given the number of people that have been convicted, there have been 50 over the last 50 years, as I mentioned, in the Western Hemisphere. How many is that per, working healthcare, workers in the Western Hemisphere over that period? And you know, wet finger in the air, 1 in 15 million. So you've got, okay, this could happen 10 times a year on average. Against this is going to happen one time in 15 million. That's the likely one, right? So this is where you start. You now go, okay, right. So I've got this looks like probably a likely thing to have. What actual specific facts do I have around this particular circumstance, this cluster, that say this is not merely random? What do I have that says that something else is causing this, and this is not random? We're not at this point looking for a perpetrator yet. We're just trying to find out reasons for not believing that this is random. Now, if every single one of the patients has got a charcoal cross on their forehead and a bullet hole playing card in their pajama coat pocket when they're found, you start going, doesn't feel like this is just random, does it? But you need to do that exercise, and that exercise might go, okay, so what are the odds of there being a statistical cluster of 15 and all 15 being found with the same charcoal cross on the forehead? That drops right down. Okay, so what's more likely that somebody did this? Okay, that drops more. Now we start saying, okay, so since we've got that information, we should start now looking at who is the person that's likely to have done that, but not until. And again, that's something that I think in this case just didn't happen. I mean, I think Dr. Evans quite proudly quoted, I looked over a cup of coffee, took me 10 minutes. I just saw immediately that there was harm going on here. It's like,
Hmm.
that must be confirmation. It's just an admission of confirmation bias, isn't it? So
Absolutely.
anyway, they're my four. I've rabbited on way
No,
too
no,
long.
absolutely great. I won't add much to that. I just want to mention one thing briefly, which is you're talking about experts and the ability of KCs to be experts. It is, of course, impossible to be an expert on every topic, and it's impossible to understand everything in the universe. It's just completely inconceivable.
Yeah, of course.
And that's why I always emphasize that I'm not an expert on this case. Clearly, I do have a good level of knowledge, and I try to bring on people who are experts in their various areas. I'll just mention briefly, I've mentioned this before, when Liz Hull was interviewed on stage by, I think, at the University of Manchester, but it was at some university. Um, she was described by the interviewer as an expert in the case, and I noticed that she didn't correct the interviewer.
No.
um, you know, she didn't say, I just attended the court case. At least I think she attended the court case. I don't know if she's mentioned that or not.
No.
But she didn't say, "Oh, I'm not an expert." She just let the person say she's an expert. So I'm always keen to emphasize that I'm not an expert in this case, but I try to bring on people who are. And for you kind of inferred or referenced the fact that KCs may typically have a bit of an ego and think they can understand anything. And just there's no one alive that can do that.
Mm.
It's just not possible. So
Yeah. Well, I'm not
you,
sure it matters whether they've got an ego or not. It's just,
mm,
if you're going to criticize a guy for not picking up a really, really sophisticated point about, the specificity of immunoassay tests, it's pretty harsh. I don't know. It
mm,
feels, I think Ben Myers has taken an awful lot of flack from everybody for
mm,
this case. Everything I've seen, he did a pretty bang up job. And so I think it's pretty rough.
yeah. My reflection would be that when you read, I don't want to pretend, I don't want to pretend I read an enormous number, but when you read, like judicial decisions, for example, the Court of Appeal verdict regarding, who we obviously know they rejected Lucy's leave to appeal previously. Um, there's always a tendency for them to be saying, look, we know better than you. You're wrong because of this. But then when you actually examine what they're
Mm.
saying, it really doesn't stand up to much scrutiny. When there's an
Yeah.
expert there who's saying, well, yeah, that's fine. Thank you for making this legal argument. But what you're saying is complete rubbish.
Mm.
So that's what I was really referencing when I say that there's to me, there's a bit of an ego. Obviously, some of it is just preserving the system,
Yeah.
but I think there is an ego aspect to it as well. So let's discuss statistical clustering. So I know this is something that you are very interested in. It's something you've spoken to me about. So can you explain why clusters can be misleading?
Sure. And I sort of started the groundwork for that in the previous thing we were discussing, Chris. But yeah, so the first thing is, look, clusters happen, right? And over the thousands of hospitals in the Western world, there's really, really good data about the likelihood of these sort of things happening. And I think, and this is where the Bayesian inference, and people get quite upset about talking about Bayesian. I've read a couple of books about it recently, so it's sort of very much top of my mind. But it's a really, really helpful and useful way of thinking about the world, and it's a helpful way of decision making in situations of uncertainty, and that's the situation you've got here. So what would so you've got your cluster. What would the Bayesian inference would say is that firstly, yeah, as I was saying before, is your prior is you have to establish your base rate. What's the base rate of this just happening at random? And then what's the base rate frequency of there being a serial murder, and compare those two things. You compare those, then you look for the reasons that are the different. So I mean, like, yeah, this is more or less what we've been talking about, but I think so. Okay, so let's just say we started with it's just completely random, and we found there is something in there that says this just can't be random. They've all got the charcoal cross on the forehead, and what that does is takes your random thing from being a 1 in 10 to a 1 in 50 million. And now step two is okay. So that what's the likelihood that an employee of a hospital has done this? Well, it's 1 in 15 million, right? For the same reason. Okay, so that's now the most likely scenario. Now we should go around looking for information that tends to validate that point or invalidate it. What makes it more likely that there was a person that went round that, was one of the staff members? What makes it less likely? You know, examine the shift rotors and it's just nobody is there on every single. So this happened to me once, by the way, at a former workplace of mine. Someone had been blocking up the lavatories. Right? They had been literally going in there and getting a whole block of toilet paper, and elbow up the U-bend, stuffing it right up as far as it could, so that the toilets just blocked up. And every morning there would be effluent running down the fire escape stairs, and it was absolutely disgusting. And the weird thing was that this happened at a different time of day in a different hospital, a different part of the building every day for about 5 weeks. And the good Bayesian people said, right, we're going to find out who did this because we're going to work out who was there, whose swipe card was there. And it didn't check out. They couldn't find anyone that was there for all of these things. So it was like, how is this possibly happening? I don't think it ever solved the problem. But okay, but there more or less is my point. You are looking for something that makes it look like it is an individual that is doing this, right? So now once you've got it is an individual, you start looking at who is the most likely individual. But you've gone into this sort of forward rather than backwards. What tends to happen in these healthcare serial murder things is that they start with, oh, cluster, whoa, hell's bells, we've got a person, and then you start to look backwards. So it's like, if you hear hoofbeats, think horses. Until you know that there are no horses, don't start looking for zebras.
Hmm.
So, what specific features of healthcare systems make clusters more likely than anywhere else?
Hmm.
So that's the other really interesting thing is, so you have real serial murderers, Jeffrey Dahmers and Ted Bundys and stuff like that. And as I mentioned, that they've fallen off a cliff. And then you've got serial murderers who are people that don't seem to have any of the pathologies of actual serial murderers. And these are, and these are people that are not, itinerant. They're not psychologically damaged. They're not waifs and strays. They're not, vagrants. But yada yada yada. But in the rest of the world, in the non-actual serial murderer world,
Hmm.
you don't get lawyer serial killers. You don't get architect serial killers, and you don't get auditor serial killers. Just not as far as I know. The only ones you seem to get are healthcare serial killers, and so that's quite an interesting fact in itself. And again, it's something that you'd like. It'd be great if these criminologists spend a bit of time just pondering that. What's going on there? What is it about healthcare? That makes it so attractive to serial murderers. And then, there are some possible answers. So, again, thinking about base rates, people who go to healthcare systems, hospitals, doctors, intensive care units, are more likely to die than people who don't, right? They have a heightened risk of dying. So, two ways of looking at that. One, right, if I'm going to murder people, that's a great cover. I'm going to go there. But two, on the other one, if I'm going to be likely to make a confirmation bias mistake, that's the sort of place where you'd expect a confirmation bias mistake as well. So secondly, people in intensive care units are significantly more likely to die than average. Okay, so go to the doctor, a little bit more likely to, because if you weren't feeling unwell, you wouldn't go to the doctor. Intensive care unit, significantly more. Now,
I
people,
mean, realistically, it's massively elevated,
of
just to
course
make
it is.
that clear.
Yeah, of course it is. And look, the other thing is, if you're talking about preterm infants. I'm no neonatologist. I'm no nothing other than a windbag. But if you're a pre, yeah, it just seems to me as a matter of logic that if you are a premature infant, there is some health condition that is triggering that, right? Because if you have no, if you're a perfectly normal natural baby, you tend not to be massively premature. But anyway, so same thing. We're just again talking about the base rates. That makes the likelihood of these people getting sick and dying by themselves higher. Now, compare that with people that work in law firms, people that work in schools, people in prisons, people in government departments. They are not any more likely than the average to die on any given day, right? Probably less likely than the average because they will exclude people who are in hospital, the people that are retired, people that are not feeling well, people that are off work, right? So if you're at work, quite unlikely to die, and probably marginally less likely even than average to die. So these base rates are important, and we should be asking ourselves questions about them. And I think we should be asking ourselves more questions about them than the prosecution seems to have done in this case.
Yes, I agree. I was actually thinking back the other day to when I first listened to the radio and heard about this case, and that was the day when I decided to start looking into it. And I was thinking about the, I wish I could go back and listen to it. Obviously, I can't. But I was trying to think about the elements that would have led me to start to think, hold on a second, this could be a bit fishy. And I think probably the very first thing, literally the first thing I thought was they probably said in the radio report, no one saw anything. If they said, obviously, someone did see her do something wrong, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So that was the first thing. And then I probably from that started thinking exactly what you've just described and explained so clearly. Well, it's a hospital. Obviously, people can die, and then it's a intensive care unit with vulnerable infants. And I knew nothing then compared to what I know now, but instantly I would have been thinking vulnerable young infants. Of course, they can die. So it's a critical point. As you say, there's a very clear reason why you'd have this almost absurdly statistically high incidence of serial killers in hospitals.
Yeah,
It's an obvious factor that
yeah.
could explain that. So I want to talk a bit more about statistics, and I want to explain something before I ask you the question. So I wanted to highlight the fact that Dr. Evans, according to his own account, and before I mention his own account, let me just say that we must take any account of Dr. Evans with a pinch of salt because he's contradicted himself so many times on so many
Oh, he
different
hasn't.
things. At this point, whenever he makes a claim, it's very difficult to say definitively
Yeah.
that he actually did say this. But I'm going to assume for the sake of argument that he did actually say this thing that he claims to have said. So what Dr. Evans claims to have said was that if the police find someone who is around for, quote, a lot of cases, they will have a suspect. Now, I would argue, and what I argue in my book, is that this essentially made the identification of a subject inevitable because there's always going to be someone who's around for a lot of cases. And the term a lot of cases hasn't even been defined. It's completely subjective. So you're not even requiring someone to be around for all of the random cases that you've just fitted around this narrative. Someone just needs to be there quite a bit. So I've argued that this makes the identification of a suspect inevitable in this case. I wonder if you have a view on this.
So you'll be surprised to hear that I do, Chris. And firstly, this all comes down to our old friend statistics again, right? So we're talking about clusters of events, and for any given cluster of events, birthdays, rainy days, unexplained collapses, there is going to be a distribution of staff presences. So let's just, take your 50 nurses and put them on things. Which days was it raining? Who was here? And you can just map that and do a nice little Gaussian bell curve to work out who was there on the most rainy days and who was there on the least rainy days. Someone is going to be in the 90th percentile of that curve. They won't have been there for all of the rainy days, unlikely, but there will be someone that is on that 90th percentile. This is just a matter of statistical distribution. Unless everybody, unless we're rolling die and every outcome is exactly the same as the other, there is just going to be that poor one person who happened to be there every day. So it's not talking about rainy days, and we're not talking about birthdays. We're now talking about days that there happen to be a collapse. So you've got one person who is just lucky old unlucky person has drawn the wrong ball out of the velvet bag, and they were there the most of the time. So if we take the Dr. Evans methodology here, you say, right, haha, we've got a suspect. So, as I say, this is skipping that first point, which is there a better explanation, which is just the random thing. Dealt with that, won't go back to it. But so, Dr. Evans' method, have we got, we've got a suspect. Let's now have a look at that suspect. Now, there are any number of ways that you can differentiate between two collapses, right? Because no two collapses are exactly the same. So the first thing I'm going to do if I'm playing the willful confirmation bias game, and again, I'm not suggesting anyone's being willful, I'm being willful here, is to say, okay, let me find the collapses for which my suspect wasn't present. And let's have a look at those. And what I'm going to do with those ones is I'm going to find a way of explaining them away as not really being like the other ones. So, oh yeah, there was a diabetes. I'll find, and there will, these kids are premature infants in an intensive care unit. There is something that you will be able to find to go, yeah, well, I suppose that one's probably explainable. Park that one away. So what you're now left with is a smaller cluster, but the smaller cluster is much more tightly focused around your suspect nurse. And you think, oh, small, it's quite small, isn't it? It's a bit discreet, it's a bit random. Why don't we go and see if we can find any more events? Now, at this point, you start trawling the records and going and having a look at what else happened before anybody was thinking, crikey, we've got a cluster here, what's going on? This behavioral fact pattern is unbelievably common in the healthcare serial murder cadre, the 50 of them, right? I've actually done quite a bit of research into just comparing them, and it happens every time a coconut. They then go back and look at other accounts and they go, oh, hello, here's one. And of course, now you've got your suspect. I'm not really interested in collapses that happened when the suspect wasn't at work, because obviously the suspect didn't cause those, right? So you go and look through her shifts for other collapses and go, could I fit that one in? Maybe, And so now you're reinflating the size of that cluster from the 5 rather unimpressive ones that it was to back to 30 or whatever it might be. And you look, now. So as Nick Johnson said in his opening speech, the evidence speaks for itself, but actually the evidence didn't speak for itself at all. And I'm doing way too much talking, Chris. Maybe I'm being interviewed, so maybe I should be doing most of the talking. But so what's quite interesting here is to compare this methodology with what happens when the police apprehend a real serial murderer. Okay, so I've got there's 6 or 7, criteria that you have to look at to compare the two between Ted Bundy style serial murderer, healthcare serial murderer. Okay, so the first thing is in which way are they similar? In both cases, no direct evidence. No one ever sees the guy doing it, because if you see the guy doing it, you got him, bang, it's done. Right, you're out. These guys don't count. Okay, so you have a situation where murders have happened, no one saw it. Okay, second question, how likely is it that there was a murder? So with the Ted Bundy ones, these people wind up, buried in shallow graves with organs missing and stuff like that. It's pretty clear they didn't just accidentally die, right? These people have very, very clearly been murdered. Healthcare serial murders, No. In every case, there is a plausible um, um, medical explanation that does not involve malice by someone. In every case, that's literally a definition of one of these healthcare serial murderers. Okay, so serial murders definitely murder. Healthcare murderers not definitely murder. Number three, do we know what the method of murder was? Again, healthcare, real serial killers decapitated, right? Okay, pretty obvious. Blunt trauma,
Mm.
broken bones. You can see it. Yes, very, very clear. Healthcare serial murderer, air embolus, insulin, C-peptide levels a bit, but it's much, much less specific. It's well, it could be that. It's consistent with that, but it's also consistent with other sort of stuff as well. Okay. So third one, methods, very certain, uncertain. Okay. What about the likelihood that these murders were committed by a single perpetrator? So not entirely certain for the series, so the Ted Bundy, but they've got signatures, they've got calling cards. Occasionally you get the ice pick in their ear and the bullet hole playing card in the breast pocket sort of thing. But they've and a lot of the job of the investigating crew will be assembling ones which were fairly highly likely committed by the same person. That's part of the investigation because otherwise he's just all over the place chasing down blind alleys. So they're very focused on that. Common perpetrator and the healthcare murderer, not certain at all. It's just other than just that inferential point, it will be unlikely for there to be multiple serial murderers operating in the same place. Uh, could be, and an interesting aspect of the Letby case, particularly, is there's no calling card. We've got multiple different murder methods. There's no rhyme or reason to it. They go from insulin to air embolus to overfeeding back to insulin. There's alleged throttling. There's stabbing in the livers. There's all sorts of stuff going on. It's just all over the place. There's nothing that points to a common perpetrator at all. Okay, here's the kicker though. Suspect identity. In a
Mm.
serial murder case, you don't know who the suspect is. That is the big unknown. I know it was murder. I know how they were murdered. I know it was the same murderer. I don't know who the murderer is. I've got to go and find people that could do this sort of stuff. In the healthcare serial murder, exactly the opposite. You start with your suspect and you go back and you backfill all the other evidence. So it's sort of the opposite thing. Right. Two more. um, Next point. When you get to your suspect, when you finally apprehend your suspect, or if you had your suspect from the first place, how much incriminating evidence is there in the suspect's possession? Serial murders generally buckets of the stuff, literally sometimes buckets of the stuff.
Yeah.
You've got lampshades made out of skin, Ed Gein. You've got murder weapons, ball hammer on the back of Peter Sutcliffe's van. Fred West, it's buried under, the body's buried under his patio. All of this sort of stuff. Once you finally found your serial murder, you're going to bang to rights. It's a Hammer House of Horrors,
Mm.
ghoulish, macabre scene. What about our healthcare serial murderers? Nothing. Occasionally they might have like a syringe in their pocket. I think
But
once
don't
one guy had a
forget,
syringe in his pocket.
don't forget, Ollie, she took home handover sheets.
Yeah,
I mean, that's just
right,
that's
right. Of course, handover
that's
sheets for other kids. Right, like hundreds of other kids that she didn't attack. It's like nothing, and they dug a garden up. Like they dug Fred West's garden up, and that was definitely worth doing. What
Mm.
were they? What what were they looking for? Digging up a garden? I mean, it's
Mm.
just like baffling, absolutely baffling. But anyway, so healthcare murderers. almost never have any really incriminating stuff. There's this loosely sort of circumstantially, well, things that make you go, like she had a shredder. I mean, we chatted about this the other day. It's like if she had a shredder, why the hell didn't she shred
Yeah.
these confession notes? And she's got these confession notes, which, are all, she wrote more about her cats on the confession notes than she wrote by way of confession. Like there's a whole sort of, there are poems to Tigger and Smudge and stuff like
Mm,
this. Like,
mm,
yeah. So,
mm.
okay. So the far last one is, what is the focus of the police investigation? In a
Mm.
healthcare, right, in a normal serial murder, it is finding the murderer. In a healthcare serial murder, it is purely incriminating the suspect you already have. Now, so for me, if that is not um, a charter for confirmation bias, then I don't know what is.
Yeah, agreed. I can't really add too much to that. It's very, very thorough. I mean, obviously, I agree entirely. Very good points, mate. Um, what you did touch upon during that answer was the bizarre catalogue of alleged murder methods in this case. So I want to discuss a couple of those with you, beginning with embolism, which I know you've mentioned to me as being a problematic aspect of the court case. So would you like to enlarge on that a little bit, please?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm reluctant to go too much into the details, Chris,
Hmm.
because I'm no, not doesn't sound like many people are experts in air ambulance, and I definitely aren't. But a couple of observations from what I have read around it, and the first one is that air embolism's symptoms are famously non-specific, and in medical terms, non-specific means they can be evidence of several different conditions. So it's not specific to air embolism. If you see these things, could be air embolism, could be something else. Um, okay, so this I think plays to this whole base rate analysis. Okay, air embolism's quite a rare thing. You know, partly because it's so hard to diagnose, I dare say, but you just don't see people, that medical procedures are designed to stop people accidentally injecting air into bloodstreams and stuff like that with perfectly good reasons. So it doesn't happen very often, but it's just like a quite an unusual thing. And so if you see something that is consistent with that, but could be consistent with something else, again, I'm not close enough to the details, but I believe trying to resuscitate a baby sometimes gets air into various places or something. Then you should not leap to the least likely conclusion first. And the other thing to say about the air embolism specifically is that Dr. Evans didn't appear to know very much about it. It's not clear where the idea of air embolism even came from in the first place. But in any case, he based his findings on a particular medical paper that he dug out, 15 years old. And who do we think the author of that paper was? Shu Lee, right? The very guy who's, oh, no one know you do, no one know, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Actually, he sounds like he knows more about air embolism than anyone else. Um, but it was his paper, and he says Dr. Evans completely misinterpreted it and got it backwards. Now, I'm going to get this wrong because I get my arteries and my veins
Hmm.
mixed up. But so this whole business about blotchy skin, which is again non-specific and could be evidence of something else, but blotchy skin is what you would expect in an air embolus if the air has been injected into a vessel that is going to the skin, right? Because that's why it shows up in the skin. Dr. Evans said, haha, I've got blotchy skin, therefore it's air embolus, so help me. But and he's saying that the air embolus he was in a vessel going to the heart because it was air in the heart bloodstream. That's what caused the collapse. So he's got it backwards. He's just has got it backwards. And Dr. Lee, bless his heart, has come out and said, hang on, you've got this backwards. And he's volunteered to give evidence to the Court of Appeal. And the Court of Appeal said, I'm not interested in hearing from you. You had your chance. You should have shown up in court, which to me feels mad. Okay, but and very, very form over substance. But bonkers. So we've got two things. Firstly, it's not very good evidence of anything anyway. Secondly, on the facts and on the basis of the guy that wrote the paper, the professional witness has completely got it backwards. And this is the evidence for most of the charges, right? I think all but five or something. So it's just completely blown out of the water. So yeah, I said didn't have much to say about embolism, but
Yeah.
that's it.
No, that's fine. One of the things I find amusing about the embolism case, and he's done this in another instance in relation to the previous court case where he was criticised, is that Dr. Evans will say, "Oh, I just don't, I don't agree with what Professor Lee has said." I'm like, well, you don't have the right to not agree because it's his paper
Mm,
and he's just right. He is just
yeah,
correct. Your opinion means nothing, nothing. Um, Except ironically, legally, it does mean something. And then he's done that. He did that again with the judge. So the judge said, "Your opinion is worthless. Your evidence is worthless. You gave no effort to give a balanced opinion." Blah blah blah. Asking about that, he just said, "Oh well, I disagree with that verdict." Well, of course you disagree. Of course you disagree because it's about you. But you
yeah,
don't have any right to disagree. The judge is presiding over the case. He
yeah,
watched what you did, so you can't
yeah,
disagree. Like
yeah,
he has no ability to accept any culpability or any mistake, or even seemingly to say that's a fair point or I respect that person's opinion. It's
mm,
just like you disagree with him, you're wrong. Even if you can't give any reason why you're wrong, you were still wrong. And I find that that level of arrogance is really aside. Obviously, I don't like the guy very much for obvious reasons, but that level of arrogance is very distasteful to me
mm,
because the measure of an intelligent person is when you encounter new information, you at least think about changing your opinion, and sometimes you do change your opinion. And if you can't do that, I just don't respect people like
yeah.
that. Really, to
Yeah,
be
well, and look, this is one of the whole problems with the expert evidence regime, and I think this is something we're probably going to touch on. But this whole question of why wasn't expert evidence presented against it? Look, I completely agree with you. I think anybody that is making any assertion about a case that is as circumstantial as this one has to accept that there is unknowns and that their theory of the case may be wrong. It's possible that there could be another explanation. And so this is, one of I've been spending way more time than I should trolling pitchforkers about this. But this is one of the points I make to them. It's like, look, I'm at least prepared to say, look, I might be wrong about this, and it's certainly possible that Ms. Letby murdered all these children and is this person. I can't gainsay that, but the pitchforkers cannot accept even a a semblance of an idea that it's possible that any aspect of the case could be mistaken or could be overstated or could be misleading. And I just for me, it's just impossible to take that seriously. And I think that's the case with Dr. Evans as well. He's meant to be a man of science. He's meant to be an expert, and experts have to understand that everything is conjecture to some extent. You are looking at evidence and trying to infer from it the probability of this thing or that thing happening. Nothing is certain. You can't. There's no proof in science, right? I don't want to get philosophical on
honest.
you and that sort of stuff. So if you are saying, "So help me, it's true, it is. It's just there's just no other possible way," there's just no credibility. Now, if an ordinary witness says that, what's your answer? Your response to that is cross-examination. Your barrister just rips them apart and makes them look stupid.
Mm.
That shouldn't happen to expert witnesses because expert witnesses should be just presenting dispassionate dry scientific data and explanation to help the jury with something that would otherwise just completely baffle them. They shouldn't be invested in the case in that way. And I suspect that was what that Mr. Myers' difficulty was with the expert witnesses that he'd had on his side, is that they were exactly like that. They were sensible, well, thoughtful, intelligent experts that actually knew what they talking about, and so they would be bound to say, well, yes, I see that there is evidence of air in this atrium or ventricle or whatever it is. I believe very strongly that it's more likely that that's evidence of something, or it's consistent with this, that, and the other thing. I can't rule out air embolus. Air embolus. It could have been air embolus, I suppose. But I think that's just a highly unnecessary and improbable explanation.
Mm.
Now, for me, that's excellent evidence, and I would trust that implicitly.
Mm.
But you've then got this ridiculously adversarial court process where this is defense evidence. And Mr. Johnson can go to the jury at the end of this and say, well, you heard from our expert, and he's an expert that this, so help me, cannot have been anything other than air embolus.
Mm.
And you heard from their guy that he couldn't rule out air embolus. I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, what do you think? Right? And you're just in a hiding to nothing. So I think Mr. Myers had no alternative but to go, look, I'm not going to put somebody up and just give my opponent a layup like that.
Mm.
I'm going to have to go after this guy and demolish him on the stand. Now, I've not seen all the cross-examination. That's another thing, by the way, for that we could put into that. What could we do to make this process work better? Transparency of all court proceedings. So why the whole thing isn't available for everybody to see and understand, so you don't get this ridiculous, well, you weren't there, you don't know, nonsense. Anyway, so yeah, that's essentially a problem. So why didn't you? I've absolutely demolished this guy on cross-examination and made him look like an absolute fool. Right now, his next step was then to go to the judge, who's in receipt of this letter from Justice Jackson about what a odd character Dr. Evans is,
Mm.
and he says, "I think we should strike out this evidence as being unreliable. We just shouldn't have it at all." Which to me seems exactly right, because this guy's posing as an expert evidence. Plainly, he doesn't know anything. Plainly, he's completely prejudged it in exactly the way described by Lord Justice Jackson. And it's very obvious why Mr. Myers wouldn't put up qualified evidence to contradict it. That evidence should be struck out, but it wasn't. And so in that way, and in so many ways, I think Mr. Myers just had his legs cut out from under him. I can't see how he could have got a better result than he did the way the case broke for him.
Mm. Yeah, fair comment. And I think the last thing I'd like to ask you about today, because we've been talking for the best part of 2 hours, and I know this is an interesting topic and a big one, is the problems with the insulin cases, the difficulties with the readings, and why this is unreliable evidence.
Okay, so this is an entire oubliette which has consumed people, swallowed them down, and not regurgitated them. People have gone down that thing and never come up again. And last thing I want to do is that. But I think you need to look at the insulin evidence for what it is and just, again, interrogate it as a piece of evidence rather than sort of the innuendo that's been thrown around it. And people get very emotive about the whole thing. But this is the actual fact, right? Lab tests showed extremely high levels of insulin and virtually no C-peptide, right? To get to, therefore, the baby was poisoned, let alone the baby was maliciously poisoned, let alone the baby was maliciously poisoned by Lucy Letby, you need to draw some insulins. You need to draw inferences, right? So
Mm.
number one, high insulin, low C-peptide is not consistent with naturally introduced insulin because the body tends to produce C-peptide proportionately. Everyone seems to accept this, but it doesn't follow from fact. It requires proof. Okay, and the proof needs to be the specific insulin test used in this case. And we know that the insulin test used in this case wasn't suitable for forensic work because it had a big red label on it saying not suitable for forensic work, right? So, first thing, doesn't sound like it's, you know, fantastically great evidence of that basic fact. Now, so secondly, how could you increase your confidence in the evidence that this is factitious insulin? Well, one thing you could do is just repeat the test, right? Oh, tap the dial, try again. Oof, that didn't look good. Run it. Now, if you get the same result twice, I'm going to say that even with a shonky equipment which is inherently reliable, that becomes a bit more likely. Run it 3 times, run it 5 times, I don't know. Run it plenty of times. But nobody did. They only ran it once. And what's more, they ran it once and didn't think anything of it.
Yeah, well, of course.
Right.
I mean, I was just going to say the reason we know the reason is simply due to there being no suspicion.
Yeah.
Simple as
No
that.
suspicion. And I think there's another quite interesting fact I saw that these insulin testing kits in this laboratory it tested itself or tested how accurate its machines were every now and then. And it had been throwing out errors exactly like this one in testing in the same month of the Letby tests. So you want to think these people are going, huh, yeah, funny reading here, but oh well. They send the labs back, don't think anything more of it. And the people at Countess of Chester didn't think anything of it either. One of the reasons being that the children recovered from their apparent insulin poisoning. And again, I don't know, I might be entirely wrong about this, but the fact that they recovered sounds to me indicative of possibly the test results being wrong rather than them actually having insulin poisoning.
Mm,
So that's one. So that's one part of this, right?
mm,
We got also insulin is present without C-peptide. So the simplest explanation for that is that patient has been administered insulin. Yep. Okay, I've got it. Lots of patients are administered insulin, so that's a common enough test result. Now, even if insulin was administered, no evidence was introduced that it was introduced maliciously or by Miss Letby. It could have been introduced by mistake. I don't know. I think there was a couple of babies in here, one of whom had actually maybe had a twin that had been prescribed insulin at some point in its stay, and could they have switched? Accidentally got the wrong baby. I mean, human error, right? This is just there just could be error. All kinds of things could have happened. Someone picked the wrong bag off the shelf, and that sort of stuff. And lastly, okay, so the patient in this case not prescribed insulin, so it was either a mistake, it was deliberate, or the test results are not accurate, or maybe this is an unusual case where the patient produced unusual amounts of C-peptide. I don't know. I'm not an expert on these sort of things, or a combination of any of the above. So, right, I suppose that the point here is we've got slim evidence that is somewhat probative of artificially introduced insulin, but it's just nowhere near a smoking gun that Lucy Letby poisoned these children. It just doesn't get near, right? So yeah, if that's it, and that seems to be the biggest, that's the Hail Mary that most of the prosecution camp are hanging their hats on. It doesn't feel like a great shot in the locker to me.
Yeah, there's a few things I want to add to this. Firstly, it's important, of course, to just reference briefly the kind of arcane process. All kinds of stuff had to be made up, all kinds of suppositions had to be made. It's yet, obviously, they didn't retain the bag. I've discussed all of this in videos. It's not as if even the idea that there were poisonings had to involve a degree of invention. It's not as if they could say, look, we've got this thing that indicates there's a high level of insulin, and therefore we know this was how it was done. No one knows how it was done. It's entirely
Yeah.
hypothetical. It's important to emphasize that. The second thing that I like to say, this is a very important point, is something that I've been considering recently. Um, in previous cases that involve nurses, we've touched upon them in this discussion. Insulin caused patients or other individuals to die. Even in the case of Dee Windsor, who was convicted of murdering her husband with insulin, almost certainly innocent. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
she still served her entire sentence. Her husband died. These infants did not die. Now the significance of that is that when this goes to the Court of Appeal, which I believe is inevitable, um, there will, let's say, all of the murders are overturned. That will be a very, very important aspect of the submission. Let's say the Court of Appeal accepts, right, well, looking at the murder cases, it's not tenable for us to retain them, so we're going to overturn them. Those that wish to believe in a guilty verdict think, oh, but the insulin cases are bulletproof. So I want people to think about what would happen if the Court of Appeal said, right, Lucy Letby officially now didn't murder any infants. We've overturned all of those cases, but we're going to keep her in prison for attempted murder based on these insulin
Mm.
cases. I would suggest that will be very difficult to do. So that's a kind of critical aspect of the appeal. The third thing I would like to say that's very important as well is that there's all manner of things that I know that about the insulin cases that I cannot say on this channel for legal reasons. And equally, I could bring on many experts onto this channel, and unfortunately, I can't do that also for legal reasons. There's nothing I would like to do more than go through the panel of 31 experts and get as many of them on as possible, which I think is very likely to be close to 31, based on the connections that I have now, and get them to explain why this is an unsafe conviction. Unfortunately, I can't do that, and there's information that is included in Lucy's appeal that we can't really reference on the channel. So I'm never able to do that. Maybe we can discuss it when Lucy's not in prison, but I just wanted to make that clear. It's a bit of a
Mm.
frustration for me, but I'm always skating around what we're able to do legally, and it's all for Lucy's benefit, really. So there's certain things I can't say. This is
Yeah.
basically the crux of that.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
the insulin is just a fascinating subculture of the criminal law because it's been criticized a lot, and the Court of Appeal has defended and defended and defended. And Dee Windsor's case is a classic case. I've read that very briefly and just staggering. It was she didn't even wasn't even there. She had a like alibi and everything.
I mean,
It
there's
was
no
just
way she did it. There's absolutely
no
no.
way she can have done it, but they are not prepared to. And it's almost as if they're treating the insulin cases as a sort of a sui generis done thing. If there, oh, if there's insulin, you're done. There's no debate. Nothing can be heard about. What I find, and again, it sort of comes back to this whole thing about really so all of these healthcare serial murderers, they all murder with insulin.
Mm,
Why don't I mean they're in a hospital, right? They're
mm,
in a hospital with all of these other um, uh, methods and implements and poisons and subtle ways you can do it. Why do they all use insulin? Anyone could use insulin. I mean, like 10 million people in the UK are diabetic and have got access to insulin. There doesn't seem to be any sort of um, a history of insulin murders anywhere else except amongst healthcare serial murderers. It's just mad and it doesn't make sense. So just stop and think.
Yeah,
If you were going to be a murderer, you wouldn't use insulin because you can get caught. It's too easy.
yeah.
C-peptide. Everyone knows about C-peptide.
Of course, that's another aspect of it. Lucy, managed to murder infants with air. Then she switched to insulin. It didn't work. So then she threw a bit of milk in for a while. Then she went back to insulin again. It didn't work. Then she went back to air again.
Yeah,
Oh, come on. I mean, it doesn't make
yeah,
any sense. It
no,
doesn't make any sense. There's no way. Why would you use insulin, as you so
yeah,
rightly say? You've already been the first person in history who successfully murdered people with milk. So what?
yeah,
So why? I mean, they didn't die, did they? There wasn't an infant that died,
yeah.
But I mean, it's just
So
it's just preposterous, preposterous.
yeah, I might be wrong about this, but I believe that the second insulin poisoning had less insulin in it than the first one. So it's
Hmm.
like first one didn't work, so let's try with less.
I think I wouldn't like to say off the top of my head because it's extremely complex, so I couldn't say whether that's correct.
Yeah, I
But
might be wrong. I thought
yeah,
I heard
I'm
that
not saying
somewhere.
you are, but you could be. So
Yeah,
it is
wouldn't be the
complicated.
first
I
time,
mean, I
Chris.
mean,
Won't
I,
be the
I
last.
I don't even. Why can't they have more distinct terms than hypoglycemic and hyperglycemic?
Yeah,
Why can't one of them be called like blancmange and the other one hypoglycemic? It would make it a hell of a lot easier, if you ask me.
yeah.
It wouldn't surprise me if people in court couldn't even tell the difference between hypoglycemic and hyperglycemic,
Yes.
and the
Oh,
barristers and the judge, because the judge doesn't even know if she injected her into the heart or the brain. So
yeah, yeah,
what chance have you got, really? Anyway, Ollie, it's been absolutely brilliant, brilliant to have you. We've done a good 2 hours there. I've still got some questions left, so if supplement those questions in the future, then we can have you back for a third time. And we know stuff is going to happen. Probably even by the time this goes out, some new stuff will have happened.
Hmm.
So I'm sure we'll be able to concoct some new questions for you. But yeah, really appreciative of your time and the aim, I know you expressed some regret that you spoke a lot, but the aim of these sessions is always for me to speak as little as possible. So it's great.
Mission accomplished.
It's great we did it. So I'm very happy with that. And I'm really, really appreciative of your very thoughtful analysis as always. So I'll speak to you again soon and thanks for your time. Really appreciate it.
Good stuff. Have a nice weekend.